It's recording.
Okay, so you are being recorded. And again, this is Erica. I'm the director for Best Buddies in Washington. And we're excited to have you all join us today for a training on true inclusion in Best Buddies. And so this is going to be a training all about disability awareness, just some terminology, things to be aware of. But then in general, just how we create an inclusive environment in Best Buddies programs, and how you can contribute to a more inclusive world through both being involved in Best Buddies, but also just how you interact with people in the world generally. I'm very excited to introduce you to Ivanova, who is one of our Best Buddies Washington State ambassadors. So Ivanova speaks all over the state on behalf of Best Buddies and gives presentations just like this and just presentations about Best Buddies in general. But in addition to being super involved in Best Buddies, Ivanova is a nationally renowned disability activist and a huge leader in the self-advocate movement, and is just one of the most knowledgeable people that I know about all things disability rights. So this is a perfect space to learn and to ask questions. And so Ivanova will be taking you through some materials that we've created, and we'll have space for Q&A at the end. But if you have a really pressing question, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask it, because we want it to be interactive and fun as well. So I'm not going to be super conscious of like muting people. So if you can, just mute yourself while we're talking, unless you have a question, and then you can unmute yourself and ask. And then you can also use the chat box. I'll be checking the chat box pretty frequently to see if we have any questions coming in that way as well. So without further ado, I am going to share my screen so that you can see our slides and hand it over to Ivanova.
All right, so I'm Ivanova Smith, and first I just want to tell you a little bit about what Best Buddies is about. So Best Buddies is it's actually an international organization that got to start helping facilitate friendships between people with disabilities and people without disabilities. And our mission, as you can see, we're a nonprofit. We're a global volunteer movement that creates opportunities for one-on-one friendship, integrated employment, leadership development, and inclusive living for those with intellectual and developmental disabilities. The people that Best Buddies serves are people with IDD or intellectual and developmental disabilities. And this is not limited to, this is you take Down syndrome, autism, fetal alcoholism, William. These are just different examples of different type of disabilities that many of us have. I actually have multiple disabilities, and so those are some of my disabilities are on that list. And also and so we have four pillars in Best Buddies: one-on-one friendships, leadership development, employment, and housing. And in Washington State, we're working on the friendships and the leadership development and the employment first. But historically, for a lot of people with intellectual developmental disabilities, we were kind of sidelined, we were segregated, not told that we weren't allowed to be friends with non-disabled people, and that made developing friendships really hard. And so there's actually a lot of history about how the disability community, we really fought for our rights to get to live in our communities. And around this time, the 1970s and 80s, there was a big push to have people with disabilities be allowed in public spaces. That's where we get the Rehabilitation Act, which it provided Native, so federal buildings had to provide accommodation. And we kept fighting for all these different type of rights so that we didn't have to live in institutions, that we had equal access to public education. And then 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act was signed. And there was a lot of allies along the way while we were fighting for these rights. And the family, the Eunice Kennedy Shriver and her son, Anthony Shriver, they're the one, Eunice founded Special Olympics. And her son, Anthony Shriver, found Best Buddies. And together it was trying to provide opportunities for people with disabilities. And it's and we've learned a lot of good messages along the way. And so that's where that's where a lot of the passion and the reason why we have those 4 pillars comes from. Next slide.
Yeah, and just something I would point out really quickly about this timeline is that you'll see, you know, a huge amount of work was done for civil rights in the 60s, but then we didn't actually get comprehensive whole-scale legislation to open up access for people with disabilities until 1990. So we've come a long way, but there's still so much.
Oh yes, so there's still a lot of things that need to be approved upon.
Yeah.
People with IDD are still heavily segregated. They use functioning labels to segregate people now. And there's still we're still ways that we're barred from doing regular things. Like it's really hard for people with IDD to get married because the mechanism to get support services, there's a thing called the marriage penalty that makes it so you can't get support services unless you have Medicaid. But to have Medicaid, you can't be married.
Right. So,
and Erica will go more into Medicaid.
Yeah, so that brings us to this slide, which is really more of just a context setting slide than anything. Many of you have probably heard of Medicaid, and you probably think, oh, Medicaid, yeah, that's for healthcare coverage for people who need, you know, additional support. And in reality, Medicaid funds things for people with disabilities that include healthcare, but also include just general, you know, life things to be able to live a full life. So Medicaid funding in part helps to fund employment supports for people with disabilities. It funds housing opportunities for people with disabilities. It funds in-home caregiving so that people with disabilities can have the right supports at home to be able to be fully, you know, functioning members of society. So Medicaid, you know, if you look at the chart, you'll see that the total percent of the Medicaid recipient population that has disabilities is only about 15% of that total percentage. But the amount of Medicaid funding dollars that goes towards people with disabilities is about 43%, because it funds so many things that are critical to just being able to live a full life and being able to access society through employment and housing and, you know, community opportunities. So when you hear about Medicaid and you hear about the fight for, you know, increasing Medicaid funding or maintaining Medicaid funding, it goes so far beyond healthcare, and it really encompasses critical critical support for people with disabilities to be able to function in the world. But as Ivanova can acutely attest to, Medicaid does not fund everything. There's still so many people that don't even qualify for Medicaid, that have disabilities, that still need support and still need access. So Medicaid helps cover part of the population, but there again is just still so much work to be done to get the right access and the right support to the right people. Anything to add to that, Ivanova?
Yeah, so I would say, this actually affects me personally. I can't get Medicaid, but I know a lot of people who rely on it, and it helps them with transportation, it helps them with housing, a lot of, and even personal care. Some of us need help with personal care, and that's really important for that. And so a lot of the policy I do as a legislator, I'm trying to make it more accessible. And also, I actually do plan in the future to do advocacy around that marriage penalty. And the one value that Best Buddies has is Best Buddies is not controlled by the system. We are volunteer based, and we don't have the same gatekeeping that the government does. And so, I'm accepted in Best Buddies, and it's not like I don't have to, provide really personal medical information to get support by Best Buddies. And so it provides a natural, it's like a natural support in that way, because and for a lot of people with IDD, and it's one thing that's really important to think about, is that a lot of us can be isolated, and the only people in our lives that know us are people who are paid to care for us. And that can be very, that could be really sad. That could not always be the best way to have relationships. You need to have people in your life that want to be in your life, that care about you because you're a human being, not because you're a paycheck. And so that's another really important thing that Best Buddies helps helps people with IDD not have that isolation, and instead have people in their lives that care about that we develop give and take friendships where we see each other as valuable people. Historically, people with IDD were put away in institutions, and there's still 4 institutions in Washington state. Faircrest, which is in Seattle, Verde School, which is in Buckley, Bonnie Lake area, Pierce County, Lakeland Village, which is in Spokane, and Yakima Valley. And these institutions, there were a lot of restrictions on people's lives, and they, you only got to be friends with other people with disabilities, and it was very segregated, and they treated the people like they were mentally children forever, which isn't true. The models that the self-advocate community, what we've really been advocating for is community living, where we're either living with our families or we're living independently, but with supports coming in to help us. Also, like adult family homes and group homes are another option that some who need more supports may go for. But these are all different options that gives individuals more freedom in their lives, and they're not as segregated. Because people with disabilities, we contribute to our communities, and it actually harms the community when we're hidden away. And so Community living is all about making sure that we all get to be part of our community and have freedom. So I just want you guys to think about these terms and like, what do you think of when you see these terms? Like, don't be scared about what don't be scared that anything you say will be offensive. This is the time that's okay to be safe and open about how you see things, and we all learn together. And so I just want you guys to think about, like, what do you guys think of when you hear about autism?
Hi. I personally think autism is seen in a very negative way when it really isn't. I do see the terms because my brother has autism, so it's always high functioning or low functioning, and those terms can be really not correct. And I do think that people have a personal opinion that autism is someone who's, because it is a spectrum. I think people see autism as this one tiny little part of the spectrum when it's so vast. So I think there's just a small proportion of like maybe media or just that we know of that's the one that's presented, even though that's not really what autism truly is, because it's such a wide variety and variance on that spectrum.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you for answering. What do people think when they hear the word bipolar?
Well, for me, when I hear bipolar, I kind of think of like mental, like the bipolar mental health, like all that stuff. That's just kind of what I think of.
Okay. What have people?
Sorry.
Oh,
I was just
ahead,
going to say, in some ways, it's thought of as mental health is a different type of thing than a disability. There's some like difference between that, and I think they're not thought of with the same stereotypes and stigmas.
Yeah. That's a really yeah. What do you guys think when you hear the word Down syndrome? Biela.
I'll say just some common words that I've heard is, like really friendly, really, smiley, and like love to hug and make friends. Those are some like common associations that I know I've heard of when people hear the word or hear the phrase Down syndrome.
Yeah, and I think from that, there definitely comes some babying. Sorry, that's my dog choking in the background on a bone. Ellie? Okay, she's fine. Yeah, so I think there's some babying that comes from that, and also just like expectations that people with Down syndrome act one way, kind of what Kennedy was saying about autism. It's just an expectation that they're on this, happy little pathway of life, and there's not variation of emotions and human experience, which is just not true.
Yeah. All really great takes. What do people think when they hear cerebral palsy? Cerebral palsy.
I'll jump in again and say some of the common things that come up when we've done this training in other places is, like mobility challenges and maybe some trouble understanding speech. Sometimes those are some common associations that come up.
Yep. And TBI.
Personally, I have a family friend who recently underwent TBI, and to me personally, I feel like I think a lot about like hard working, because I like have seen the family and the individual work very hard to like recover and rehabilitate. So I just see it as very like yes, it is tragic, but I don't know, just very hardworking and persevering.
Awesome. Those are all really great answers. Thank you for doing that little exercise with me. And so we just also, there are different types of disability umbrellas, and different diagnoses could go under multiple of these categories, because cerebral palsy is a developmental disability. You're born with it, but it's also considered a physical disability because it doesn't affect your intellectual. Sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. So it can be in two or more categories. And people could have multiple of these disabilities, but like there's IDD, and then there's physical disability. Other type of physical disabilities be like a spinal cord injury or multiple sclerosis, or anything that affects your mobility. Mental illness, bipolar depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, PTSD. Those are all examples of psychological disabilities. Some people like to call them psychological disabilities. Other people call it mental illness. But different terms get used. Some people use the word mental disabilities too. Sensory disability is like it affects your senses, so like your blindness and deafness are examples of sensory disabilities. Oops. And also there's other type of disabilities that you can get later in life, so like stroke and traumatic brain injury. And so there's what more unique ones as well, that they kind of a mess of the different categories. Also, there's people with dual diagnosis. This is true for me. I actually have dual diagnosis. My because I have my IDD, and then I also have depression, and I also was born with clubfoot. So I actually was born with a physical disability that was corrected called clubfoot. And so that's an example of dual diagnosis. And it's very common for people with IDD to have multiple diagnoses.
Yeah, and I think one of the big takeaways from just thinking about disability as an umbrella, and also thinking about all of the different ways that disability can play out in someone's life, is that you can know someone with one type of disability, and their experience could be completely different than somebody else who may have the same disability, but it just impacts them in a different way, or maybe they have different diagnoses that go along with that disability. There's a saying in the autistic self-advocacy movement, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism, because everybody is different and disabilities show up in so many different ways. And it's really sort of unique to the individual, what their disability means to them and how it plays out in their life.
Yep, that's exactly it. Everybody's different. Everybody's disability is different, and everybody's support needs are different. Like there's some autistic people that can drive, and I can't. So this is one that sometimes is confusing to people. There's two different philosophies on what is the correct language and how to refer to people with disabilities. The first one is people first language, and this is where you like say, I'm a person with autism, I'm a person with intellectual disability. And this one is the reason why this one was started, it was during the deinstitutionalization movement, And the idea behind it was to remind people that we were people first. A lot of the diagnosis and labels that we were given because of our disabilities, those labels were used against us by medical professionals to take away our civil rights. And so for a lot of people with intellectual disabilities, it's really important to remind people that we are human beings and we deserve the same rights as you. We are people first, and our disabilities should not take away our humanity. And so it's a very important history with the People First movement and the People First language. It was reminding people that we are people, because there's a lot of policy that try to treat us as unpeople. And now there is a newer wave of disability language, and this has come about more in the 1990s with the neurodiversity movement, and coming out with disability pride and saying we shouldn't have to feel ashamed of our disabilities. We should not have to hide our disabilities. We should demand our rights, but we should demand our rights with our disabilities worn proudly. And so Identity First language was really about disability pride and empowering people to feel good about their bodies, feel good about the fact that having a disability is just like having your ancestry or your nationality. Like, we don't say to people, oh, I am with Americanism, or I have Americanism. We don't say that. We say we're American. So we say we're a certain gender. Like we don't like say a person with womanness. We say a woman. And so Identity First language is really taking the idea of disability. It's kind of like, it's the same thing as like a nationality or a cultural ethnicity type thing, and that's something you can take pride in, and it's not bad to have a disability. And so that's where that comes from. A lot of the people in the deaf community and the autistic community are very into Identity First language. And so just keep that in mind if you meet people that are part of those communities. A lot of times they prefer Identity First, but a lot of people with intellectual disabilities prefer People First language. And people always ask me, well, Ivanova, which one do I choose? Well, what I tell people is, why not both? Just respect how people identify. Just, ask, if you're not sure, just respectfully ask. Like, I want to be respectful of how you like to talk about disability, and people usually answer very well to that. And so I always just tell people, be person-centered about it. And just respect how people identify. And if you're talking about a group of people, it's usually better to use the people with disabilities, the group of people with disabilities. That makes more sense to use the People First language when you're talking in a collective sense. I hope that makes sense. Next slide. So this is something that's really important, and that is children are children, and they develop as children develop, just like anyone else. And some kids, they get ahead of other kids, but that doesn't mean that they're different levels or anything. Kids are kids, and they grow and learn just like anyone else. And when kids become adults, they become adults, and that is true for everyone, including people with disabilities. Mental age theory is wrong. And you probably have heard about mental age theory. Like, if you watch the news and they describe a person with IDD as somebody who's, they look like an adult, but they have the mental age of a 5-year-old or something like that. that's a very common way that it's used, but it is a very disrespectful, and it's actually a very oppressive way to refer to people with intellectual disabilities. Because when we become adults, and when we hit puberty, when you all, your peers and yourselves, you are all if you're teenagers, and you would not want somebody calling you a kid for the rest of your life. I'm sure none of you would want to be called a kid for the rest of your life. That would be infuriating. Well, that's what it's like for a lot of people with intellectual disabilities, is we don't get to have that rite of passage. And that's something that we're trying to change now, because that theory has actually hurt a lot of people in our communities and have taken away our rights. And we all have the right to learn and grow, and it shouldn't matter that you have a disability and not. You should have the right to learn and grow. And you also should get to learn about why your bodies are changing. So you should get to go through the same transitions and rites of passage through as your peers do. It may be modified, like, I would never able to complete the rite of passage of driving. Like 16-year-olds, you learn to drive and you get a license. And for a person with IDD, like myself, I never learned that, and I've never able gain that rite of passage. However, I did gain other rites of passage, and I did things in a different way. I still get around independently using the bus, and so that's all people with disabilities want. If they want to have those alternative ways to claim those rites of passages, but that doesn't mean we can't, that we're not adults, and that we don't become adults, because we become adults just like anyone else, just like you become an adult. Your peers with disabilities are becoming adults. I hope that makes sense. I went a little long there. But don't be surprised that, we have interests in sex. We have interests in that. We date. We want to get an education. We want to work. We want to work in our communities. We want to get our first job. And we also want to get careers too, and get a higher education. We have personalities. And boy, when I was a teenager, I was looking forward to my 21st birthday just as much as any of you all are. And so, these are just things to think about, that, people with disabilities, we're not completely different from you all. We're experiencing the same things you're experiencing. And I've experienced it already, so I'm older, so I may not be able to relate to you all now because I'm older, but I was a teenager, and when I was a teenager, I wanted to work. I was furious of being not allowed to go into academic courses. Those times I was denied courses that I wanted to be in because of my disabilities, and that was really painful, and it wasn't right. And so, people with disabilities, no matter support needs, we desire the same thing that you all desire for your futures. Next slide. And so what I want you to assume about us is that we can be independent, and we have abilities. We're intelligent. We have all different types of intelligence, and we just have different learning styles. And that we really should have, we should truly have true inclusion, integration. We just want to be in our communities, living our life just like you are living your life, I know probably you're wanting to get out of your parents' house. Well, we want to get out of our parents' house too. I wanted to move out as soon as I turned into an adult. I wanted to move out. And a lot of people with disabilities want to, but they need support. So sometimes we get stuck living with our parents, and sometimes that's not fun. And so that's something to think about, is that it's hard for people when there's a lot of barriers to us getting to have those freedoms. Is it okay to be curious? So I know it's, you probably have a lot of questions in your head, and you may see somebody with a disability and think, man, what, I'm curious, what's their life like? Well, these are some things that are okay to ask. And sometimes there's some people, me, I'm an open book. You can ask me anything and I will tell you. I can't hold a secret about myself worth a penny. I just can't do it. But so I'm really open, and you can ask me anything. And people will ask me why I'm rocking on the bus, and I'm just like, oh, I'm autistic, that's why. And I just explain it happily. But there's some people with disabilities, they don't like answering a lot of personal questions, and they get kind of cranky about it, and they're just not comfortable with it. If you were asked your personal information all the time, you would probably start getting tired of it too. So, just, be mindful of, some people are very open and they'd be happy to tell you, and other people, they're not going to want to tell you anything. So just, be respectful of that. So understanding other ways of thinking. So, it sometimes takes us extra time to process things and understand things. And when we feel rushed, it gets us really frustrated, and the way that we express agitation may look odd or strange, but it's a way that we try to, our bodies process that. And so we may need extra processing time, like breaking information up, giving us more time, providing more instruction, one step. Use visuals. Like, I'm very visually minded, so that's very helpful for me. And for people who can't read, it's very helpful. Frustration and stuff, that could be a sign that it's too much information, or you're overstimulated, or you just can't process what people are saying, and so you start getting frustrated. And so some things you could do is, it's like, hey, do you need a break? Or maybe we'll give you a couple of minutes to process this, or do you want to work on something else for a little bit and you can think about it later. Sometimes the way to help somebody know that they understand is use a tell, show, do model. Tell how to do it, show how to do it, ask the person to do it. When telling and showing, do things one step at a time. Do you want to give an example of this, Erica?
Yeah, so a lot of times, if you're even a good example, we have a Netflix party coming up on Wednesday that we're doing for Best Buddies Washington. And we could just send all of the steps out, in a big list of steps to take to download Netflix Party and join. Or we could, which is what we're planning to do, make a little video tutorial where we tell how to do it. We show the steps to download Netflix Party and add it to your browser, and then use the link to join the Netflix Party. And then we leave pauses in the video for people to actually do it themselves. So they're seeing it, they're hearing what to do, they're seeing an example, and then they're able to practice it or try it themselves. So that model works really well if you're, just trying to work with someone on something and it may be, maybe you're not like, you're explaining it and it's not making sense, or you're not explaining it in a way that makes sense to them. So you can try that, just showing how to do it and then kind of going back and forth that way.
Yep. Thank you.
And one other question that we had submitted ahead of time, Ivanova, that is kind of along these same lines, in thinking about the different ways that people communicate. So some people, like you said, aren't able to read. Some people are nonverbal. What are some of the different ways to think about presenting information so that you can make it accessible to everyone?
Well, one thing that we do, don't have everything in writing, have visuals and videos and audio offerings. Some people, they may need one-on-one support, and they may need actual, like doing physical activity with them, like hands-on, to help them learn. Like you're talking, let's say you're talking about doing the virtual walk. The person may need to practice a couple of times before, and they may need to actually do it, go through the actual physical steps, not just write it down or talk about it, but actually do the activity.
Awesome. And that sort of gets into, I think, what we have on the next slide about accommodations too.
Yep.
So what else would you add about accommodations?
What I would say for accommodations, there's a lot of different ways to accommodate, and just being yeah, so just talking to the person one-on-one and doing like a person-centered plan, just being person-centered. Don't try to assume a person's accommodation need. Listen to what they say their accommodation is. Don't assume what you think their accommodation would be.
Yeah. Accommodations are all about just really thinking in a really creative way about all the resources that you have available to make something accessible for someone to be able to participate. So a lot of times a term that you'll hear a lot when talking about accessibility is universal design. And that is when you, like, let's say you're going to plan an event. So when you start the planning process for the event, you actually think about all of the different ways that people might be engaging in the different accommodation needs that they have, and you build that into the plan for the event itself. And by doing that, you'll be helping people that need to access it in different ways, but you're also helping everybody have a better experience. So one of the best examples of universal design is, curb cuts. When you're like walking down the street or you're on the sidewalk and there's a curb cut that leads down to the street level. Those were designed for people who were using wheelchairs that needed to be able to, go down to the street and cross the street to get to the other side. But curb cuts are super valuable for people who have strollers, for parents who have kids in their strollers. They're super helpful sometimes for bikers. They're helpful for people who have, a cart of groceries that they're pulling home to their apartment from the grocery store. So it's something that was designed for one purpose, but sort of captures everybody in between. And that can often happen when you're designing with accommodations in mind. Okay. And then I don't think we have time to show this video, but I'll send out the link so that everyone can watch it in your own time because it's a really awesome video. But Ivanova, can you just say a little bit about Inspiration Speak generally?
Yeah, so Inspiration Speak, it's an idea that like people this this person does a really good job explaining it, but she used an example of she gets an award for just being a regular student. You know, she hasn't done anything special except, you know, being a student with a disability, and, you know, she just going through classes and, you know, doing her thing and being an average student. And people were like treating her like she was out of the ordinary because she was a person with a disability living her life. And so instead of, you know, finding something that she, you know, an actual accomplishment that she had done, they gave her an award just for being a person with a disability. And it wasn't really it was based off of inspiration. It wasn't based off of anything that was like something she did. And so that can be called inspiration porn. But it's like when people think that you're like a superhero because you do ordinary things, and it's really comes from a premise of pity, that people with disabilities are not supposed to be able to do ordinary things, and that we're supposed to just be stuck at home in our beds, not being able to do anything. But, you know, we would live regular lives, you know, we just live our regular lives, and it shouldn't be a shock for us to just be doing regular things. We want to be praised for our actual accomplishments, not just because, you know, I got up in this morning. You know, I got up this morning.
Right. Awesome. All right, so we have reached the Q&A portion. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and then I am also going to stop the recording just so that we can make this as open and welcoming as possible to ask any questions that may be on your mind. So I'm going to stop